At my daughter's beach wedding, my own child looked me in the eye and said, "If you can't give us $50,000, you might as well enjoy solitude in an old age home." Her fiancé smirked beside her, nodding like a judge handing down a sentence. I froze, champagne glass trembling in my hand as laughter rippled through the crowd who thought it was a joke, but it wasn't. My entire life, every night shift, every dollar saved, every sacrifice I made was being erased in front of strangers. I didn't scream. I smiled, because they had no idea what was coming next. I was 63 years old, standing in the mirror of a borrowed hotel room, fastening the clasp of a dress I had bought secondhand, but pressed until it gleamed like satin. The ocean air seeped through the cracked window, carrying with it salt gull cries and the faint music of a string quartet rehearsing down by the beach. For most mothers, a daughter's wedding is a milestone, a moment of reward. For me, it was supposed to be proof that every sacrifice I had made over 35 years had not been in vain. I had lived my life inside hospital corridors where fluorescent lights replaced sunlight and the sound of heart monitors became the rhythm of my existence. 35 years as a nurse. 35 years of double shifts, Christmas Eves traded for emergency calls, and the ache in my bones that lingered long after the scrubs were folded away. I raised my daughter, Elena, alone after her father died when she was 8. He left behind nothing but his watch, a box of unpaid bills, and a smile frozen in the only family portrait we'd ever managed to take. From that day, it was just her and me. Every paycheck went into keeping a roof over our heads and her education alive. I sold the small house where Elena had taken her first steps. It broke me more than I admitted, but it covered her college tuition. I worked night shifts so she could focus on her studies. When her friends went on spring break, she went because I picked up 40 extra hours that month. She wore gowns at formals while I wore hospital clogs with soles worn thin. That was motherhood as I knew it, silent, constant, invisible. Still, I never once asked for recognition. The thought of her walking across that graduation stage was enough, and when she met Derek, polished and ambitious, I told myself perhaps my sacrifices were finally leading her toward stability. He was a lawyer, well-spoken, sharp. I ignored the subtle dismissiveness in his tone, the way he referred to me as your mom instead of Mrs. Whitmore, as if I were a relic instead of a person. I told myself Elena was happy, and if she was happy, then so was I. When the engagement was announced, I emptied what remained of my savings for her dream wedding. I had no retirement cushion left, just a modest monthly pension that barely covered rent. But Elena wanted a destination wedding by the sea. I told myself I could manage. I sold furniture I didn't need. I cashed out the small bond I'd been keeping for emergencies. And then, just 3 weeks before the wedding, I did the unthinkable. I sold my wedding ring. The band her father had slipped onto my finger decades ago, the one I had guarded through widowhood, through grief, through nights of loneliness when it was the only thing that made me feel married still. A young jeweler looked at it through his magnifier, then quoted a number that felt like both an insult and a lifeline. I nodded, slid the ring across the counter, and told myself, "This is for Elena. This is what love looks like." On the morning of the wedding, I carried the envelope of cash to the event planner's office. My hand shook as I handed it over, not from regret, but from exhaustion. That envelope represented not only the gold of a ring, but the marrow of my life, carved out piece by piece. Yet as I stood before the mirror adjusting the hem of my dress, I felt a fragile sense of pride. Today, I told myself, my daughter would look at me with gratitude. Perhaps she would hug me in front of everyone, perhaps whisper a thank you that would erase decades of fatigue. By the time I reached the beachfront, the ceremony was already dazzling. Guests in pastel suits and flowing dresses sipped cocktails. Photographers circled like moths to light. The arch of white roses framed the ocean's horizon, and Elena looked radiant, every inch the bride magazines promised. I watched her laugh with Derek, their heads leaning together like a picture of future wealth and power. My heart swelled, ignoring the sting of sacrifice still etched in my veins. I thought back to every scar of this journey. The night I stitched my own hand after dropping a glass at work because I couldn't afford the ER fee. The afternoons I fainted in the kitchen from hunger because I made sure Elena's plate was full while mine stayed empty. All of it had led here. And now, standing with a glass of champagne, I told myself my time had come. Finally, I would be seen. But sometimes, the moment you believe you've arrived at the peak is the very second you discover the cliff beneath your feet. I raised the glass to my lips, smiling faintly at a neighbor who had flown in for the occasion. The sun shimmered against the waves, the band struck its first note, and for a fleeting second I thought, this is my reward. And yet, deep down, something in my bones whispered otherwise. I thought it was just nerves. I was wrong. I was about to learn that the price of love for them was not 35 years of sacrifice. It was a number, $50,000, and they were ready to put that price on me in front of everyone. I believed I was seconds away from being honored as the mother who gave everything. But the hand holding that glass of champagne, steady, proud, was about to tremble under the weight of an invisible slap. I thought I was about to be honored. But the hand holding that champagne glass was about to tremble from an invisible slap. The ceremony ended with applause, rose petals drifting through the air as Elena and Derek sealed their vows with a kiss. I clapped too, my hands stinging more from emotion than effort. For a moment, I almost believed the day would pass without complication, that perhaps my cynicism was just the product of a tired heart. Dinner was served beneath a canopy, strung with fairy lights. The ocean behind us, a restless witness. I sat at a round table near the front, close enough to see the bride smile, far enough to be invisible when her gaze swept the crowd. Then Derek stood. He tapped a fork against his glass, drawing silence with the ease of a man accustomed to commanding rooms. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice booming above the surf, "today is not only a union of love, but of families, of legacies." He looked toward me, and I straightened instinctively, expecting some acknowledgement of the woman who had raised Elena alone. My heart beat faster, my throat tightened in anticipation. He smiled wide, charming, and false. But building a legacy requires investment. It requires sacrifice. And today we're asking for one final gift to ensure Elena and I begin our marriage on the strongest possible foundation. He let the words hang, then turned directly toward me. "Clara, if you truly want to see your daughter thrive, we'd like you to contribute $50,000 today as a symbol of your support." The room didn't gasp the way I expected. Instead, a ripple of laughter broke out. Some guests even clapped, mistaking his demand for some elaborate game. A wealthy uncle called out, "Make it a bidding war!" More laughter followed. My glass shook against the table, and I realized with horror that they thought this humiliation was entertainment. Elena leaned into Derek's shoulder, her voice pitched sweetly, but her words sharper than any scalpel I had ever held. "Yes, Mother. If you can't, then maybe it's time you prepared for solitude in an old-age home. After all, isn't that where women like you end up?" I stared at her, searching for the girl who once clung to my hand on the first day of kindergarten, who cried into my uniform when the world felt too big. But she wasn't there. In her place stood a woman with practiced detachment, smiling for cameras as if her cruelty were just another pose. Around us, the misunderstanding spread. Some believed it was a playful toast. Others whispered awkwardly, unsure. My sister, Elena's aunt, averted her eyes, sipping her wine. My cousin fiddled with his phone. Not one voice rose in my defense. Not one hand reached for mine. The silence inside me roared louder than the crowd. I had imagined gratitude. Instead, I was reduced to a purse they could rattle before strangers. My sacrifices, 35 years of sleepless nights, the house I sold, the ring I pawned, meant nothing. I tried to speak, but my throat closed. Words would not come. So I sat, my back straight, my face calm, while inside, something cracked, clean through. The champagne tasted bitter now, every bubble like an insult rising. Derek continued, oblivious or perhaps entirely aware of the cruelty. 50,000 isn't much when you consider the decades of love Clara has already shown. Think of it as completing the circle. His grin widened, sharp and rehearsed. Elena raised her glass, clinking his. To new beginnings, she said. Her eyes met mine, daring me to refuse. I did not toast back. The clapping resumed, polite and uncertain, as though the guests feared missing the joke. A man at the next table muttered, "They must be wealthy already." And I realized no one understood the truth. That every dollar I had once held, I had already bled into my daughter's life. I scanned the faces, cousins, friends, colleagues from the hospital years who had come out of respect. None of them looked at me. I was surrounded by 100 people, yet utterly alone. I forced a smile, the kind nurses wear when patients rage at them for pain that can't be helped. A mask, a shield. Beneath it, I was unraveling. Elena leaned closer to Derek, whispering something I couldn't hear, then laughing softly. Her laugh pierced me more than her words. It was a sound I had once lived for. Now it was the blade she twisted with practiced ease. The ocean crashed louder, the wind rose, and the lights above us flickered once, as though the world itself knew what had just occurred. I placed my glass carefully on the table, afraid my shaking hand might shatter it. Inside, shame and fury collided, but I knew better than to give them what they wanted. A scene, a confirmation that I was fragile, desperate. I would not beg. I would not protest. I would let them believe they had won. Because sometimes silence is sharper than any weapon. I looked at Elena one last time, my face still calm. She smiled wider, certain she had secured her victory. But victories are often illusions, and humiliation, when endured quietly, has a way of planting seeds no one can see. So I sat, my heart breaking, my body steady, and I smiled. Tell me, have you ever been turned into a public joke by the very person you raised? Have you ever felt the room laugh while your dignity was stripped bare? If you have, then you will understand why I only smiled that night. I stood from the table quietly, unnoticed, as the music swelled and waiters carried trays of champagne between laughing guests. My chair scraped softly against the wooden floor, but no one turned. Elena was busy posing for photographs, Derek shaking hands with one of his groomsmen. It was as if I had evaporated, a shadow dissolving into the salt-heavy air. My shoes pinched. I had bought them on clearance, too small but polished bright for this day. They were supposed to carry me across a dance floor where I imagined holding my daughter one last time before giving her fully to her new life. Instead, they carried me toward the edge of the deck, toward the sand below. I slipped them off without thought, leaving them by a pillar like abandoned promises. The first touch of sand on my bare feet felt colder than expected, like an omen. I moved down the beach slowly, each step swallowed by the tide's retreat. Behind me, laughter rose again from the tent. Toasts, music. A party I was no longer part of, though my sacrifices had paid for every flower on those tables, every note from the hired band. The contrast between their celebration and my silence was unbearable. I stopped near a dune, turning back just once. The glow of lanterns framed Elena in her white gown, Derek's arm around her waist. She leaned close, her lips brushing his ear. The wind carried a shred of her words toward me, cruel and sharp. It's done. My parents are worth nothing now, except for whatever money they can cough up. For a moment, I could not breathe. The sentence didn't just pierce me, it hollowed me. All those years, all those sacrifices collapsed into a single truth spoken with casual cruelty. I wasn't her mother. I was a ledger entry, a dwindling account she had already written off. My knees buckled, but I forced myself upright. I could not collapse here, not in view of their triumph. So I walked farther down the beach, letting the waves erase my footprints as though I had never existed. Each step was heavier, my body fighting to carry the weight of betrayal. My chest ached as though my heart had been squeezed dry. The ocean roared louder the farther I went, drowning the music behind me. For the first time in decades, I was utterly unmoored. There was no patient to tend, no child to feed, no husband waiting at home. Just me, alone, stripped bare of the one identity I had clung to for so long. Mother. A gull circled overhead, shrieking, its cry slicing through the night. I tilted my head back, watching it vanish into darkness. I wondered if I, too, was vanishing. A woman unseen, unremembered, irrelevant. Would anyone notice if I kept walking until the waves swallowed me whole? The thought frightened me, not because I longed for death, but because it felt possible. That was the true cruelty of the evening, not the demand for money, but the realization that my existence could be erased without ripple or protest. I sank to the sand, hugging my knees, the hem of my dress soaking with seawater, the stars blurred with tears. I remembered the nights I worked until dawn, stumbling home to find Elena asleep, her textbooks spread across the kitchen table. I remembered her first recital, when I stood clapping until my hands ached. The nights I stayed awake by her bedside, cooling her fever with damp towels. Were those memories false? Or had she buried them so deep beneath ambition that they no longer mattered? The tide crept closer, lapping at my ankles. I let it. Cold, biting, real. Unlike the hollow warmth of applause echoing from the wedding tent. I don't know how long I sat there, body trembling, staring at the line where sea met sky. Long enough that the music became muffled, long enough that the sand began to chill my bones. Finally, I rose. My dress clung heavy, my feet raw from shells and stones, but I walked, away from the laughter, away from the humiliation, away from the girl who had once been my world. With every step, I faded from their lives. No one called my name, no one came searching. I was gone, and yet, for the first time, something inside me stirred, a fragile flicker, like a candle refusing to die. Because in disappearing, I felt the faintest pulse of freedom. I had lived decades as a servant to duty, to love, to obligation. Tonight, stripped of all of it, I was nothing. And nothing, perhaps, could become anything. The moonlight cast my shadow long across the sand. Alone, barefoot, nameless, I walked into the dark. I vanished from my daughter's wedding, erased from her story. But in that very moment, I began to write my own. I disappeared from my daughter's wedding. Yet that was the night I started to exist again. The motel room smelled faintly of bleach and old carpet, the kind of place tourists never booked twice. I sat on the edge of the thin mattress, my dress still damp from the ocean, grains of sand clinging stubbornly to the fabric. My bare feet were raw, my hands trembling as I pulled the small suitcase closer. It wasn't much. Just a few changes of clothes, a bottle of aspirin, and one worn leather journal that had followed me across decades. I hadn't opened the journal in years. It was my husband's, a place where he scrawled patient notes, ideas for the future, and sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, his private thoughts. After his sudden death, I tucked it away, unable to face the reminders of a life cut short. But tonight, stripped of everything, I needed his voice more than I needed air. The pages crackled as I turned them, yellowed at the edges, his handwriting slanted and messy, memories unfurled with each line. The day Elena was born, the night he surprised me with tickets to a concert, his notes about saving for Elena's education. Then, tucked near the back, one page caught my eye. The ink was smudged, as though written in a hurry, but the words leapt at me with startling clarity. Don't let anyone put a price on your love. You've given enough. You are enough. I pressed the page to my chest, the tears coming before I could fight them. It felt as if he were in the room, speaking across years and silence. For the first time since the wedding, I let myself sob, shoulders shaking, grief and betrayal pouring out in ragged waves. The sound was ugly, raw, but it was mine. When the storm inside me subsided, I noticed something wedged inside the back cover. A folded envelope, brittle from time. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a bank statement from nearly 20 years ago, numbers I didn't understand at first. Then it struck me. My husband had left behind a retirement account, one I had never known existed. The statement was old, but the balance was real. He must have opened it quietly, saving scraps of money he hadn't told me about. Perhaps he feared emergencies. Perhaps he wanted a safety net for Elena. Or perhaps, most likely, he wanted to make sure that if he couldn't be here, I wouldn't fall apart. I logged into my email on the battered motel laptop, heart racing as I searched for any clue. After a few attempts, after guessing at passwords only he would have chosen, our wedding date, Elena's birthday, the year he graduated nursing school, I found it. The account was still active, and the balance had grown. Not millions, not wealth, but enough. Enough to breathe again, enough to prove I wasn't as destitute as they believed. My breath caught in my throat, a mixture of disbelief and relief. For so long, I had carried the weight of scarcity, believing every sacrifice left me poorer, emptier. Yet here was proof that love, his love, had quietly been saving me all along. I leaned back against the headboard, tears still streaking my cheeks, but a smile beginning to take root. Not a smile of triumph, not yet, but the fragile smile of someone who realized she wasn't broken beyond repair. The room was silent except for the hum of the old air conditioner. Outside, the ocean roared, steady and eternal. I closed my eyes and let its rhythm soothe me. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of something like possibility. They thought they had stripped me bare. They thought I had nothing left, no future, no dignity. But they were wrong. I touched the journal again, whispering into the dim light. You knew, didn't you? You knew one day I'd need this. My husband's words echoed inside me, stronger now, almost like a vow. You are enough. I allowed myself to rest. My body, weary from years of sacrifice, finally unclenched. My mind, still bruised, began to imagine what could come next. For the first time since the wedding, I didn't feel invisible. I felt anchored. And though my tears had not yet dried, there was a softness in me, a warmth I thought had been extinguished forever. They believed they had won by shaming me, by erasing me in front of strangers. But they didn't know about the journal. They didn't know about the account. They didn't know about the fire that still flickered, waiting to rise. They thought I was empty-handed, but sometimes the dead leave gifts that outlive them. They thought I was ruined. But love, real love, has a way of surviving betrayal. They thought I was powerless. But tonight, alone in this motel room, I understood the truth. They thought I was finished. They were wrong. They think I am penniless. But the dead sometimes leave behind gifts that never die. The money my husband had hidden away was not enough to buy back every sacrifice, but it was enough to buy me space to breathe. Within a month, I signed the papers for a small cottage along the coast. It wasn't glamorous. Paint chipped along the shutters, the roof sagged from years of neglect. But when I stepped onto the porch and inhaled the salt air, I felt something loosen inside my chest. It was mine. Not Elena's, not Derek's, not bought for anyone else. Just mine. I spent days repairing it myself, scrubbing floors, patching walls, planting flowers in the sandy soil out front. My body ached after each day's work, but the ache was different than the one I carried from hospital shifts. This ache was purposeful, proof that I was building again, this time for me. When the cottage was ready, I placed a hand-painted sign outside, First Aid and Wellness for Women. It started with 3 women from the neighborhood, widows who had heard about me through word of mouth. They wanted to learn basic first aid, CPR, how to care for themselves as they aged. I taught them what I knew: bandaging, blood pressure checks, how to respond to emergencies. They listened with rapt attention, notebooks open, eyes hungry for more. When the class ended, they stayed behind sharing stories. One woman confessed her son had moved across the country, barely calling except to ask for money. Another whispered that her daughter had placed her in a small apartment and rarely visited, ashamed of her frailty. The third simply cried, saying she had no one left at all. I listened, nodding, and realized with a pang that their stories mirrored mine. Betrayal, neglect, invisibility. It wasn't just my curse, it was theirs too. Word spread. Within weeks, my little cottage was filled with women, each carrying her own wounds carved by family. They came not just for first aid lessons, but for healing of another kind. They laughed together, cried together, held each other's hands when the weight of silence grew too heavy. Without intending to, I had become their anchor. I didn't call myself a leader, but they did. They began referring to me as Mother Clara, a title that startled me at first. I had been stripped of the word mother by Elena, but here it returned to me, not from blood, but from choice. It was the sweetest gift I had ever received. One afternoon, as I demonstrated how to use a defibrillator, a young woman with a camera approached. She introduced herself as a journalist from a local station, having heard about my classes from one of the attendees. At first, I refused. I had no interest in publicity. But the women urged me on, insisting the world needed to hear our stories. The segment aired 2 weeks later, a short piece titled The Resurrection Mother, One Woman's Quiet Rebirth. The camera had captured me mid-laugh, surrounded by women who looked lighter than when they'd arrived. For the first time in years, I saw myself smiling, not the forced, brittle smile I'd worn at Elena's wedding, but a genuine one, unburdened, radiant. The phone calls began after that, messages of gratitude, requests to join the classes, donations from strangers who said my story gave them courage. I didn't feel like a heroine. I felt like a survivor who had finally learned to breathe again. Yet the women looked at me as though I was something more. And maybe, in their eyes, I was. For the first time, my days ended not in exhaustion, but in satisfaction. I went to bed with the sound of the ocean outside my window, the journal of my husband on the nightstand, and the laughter of women still echoing in my ears. I knew Elena and Derek believed they had silenced me, erased me from their story. They thought I was broken, discarded. But each day in that cottage was proof that they had been wrong. They hadn't destroyed me. They had freed me. I stood on the porch one evening, watching the sun melt into the horizon, the cottage glowing behind me with the hum of women sharing tea and conversation. My heart swelled, not with bitterness, but with pride. The life they thought they had stolen from me had only been reborn into something greater. But as I watched the waves roll in, a thought crept quietly across my mind, sharp and undeniable. Elena and Derek still didn't know. They didn't know I had survived, rebuilt, thrived. They didn't know their plan had unraveled before it had even begun. And one day, whether by chance or by fate, they would learn the truth. But not tonight. Tonight was for me, for us, for every woman who had been told she was nothing and had risen anyway. They thought they had written the final chapter of my life. They didn't know I had already started writing a new one. But what about them? They had no idea their plan had already collapsed in silence. A year passed like the tide, slow and relentless, erasing the footprints of the past, yet leaving behind traces of what had once been. My cottage by the sea thrived. Classes grew, women came from neighboring towns, and our small circle blossomed into a community. We celebrated birthdays, shared meals, and stitched our broken pieces together. My laughter became real, my sleep peaceful. For the first time in decades, I belonged, Not because I had given everything away, but because I had finally chosen myself. Elena and Derek, however, lived a different story. Their wedding had been their peak. Afterward came decline. Derek's investments soured, risky ventures collapsing under the weight of arrogance. Elena, once radiant in designer gowns, found herself pawning jewelry to pay overdue bills. The whispers of their financial ruin spread through their circle, and the friends who had toasted their union quietly disappeared. By the time the year ended, they were drowning in debt, creditors circling like vultures. And so one evening, they came searching for me. Not for reconciliation, not for love, for money. I didn't know it at the time. I was preparing for a community gathering at the local hall, a night where we would share stories of resilience, a night the town had organized in my honor. A journalist had called it a celebration of survival. I called it simply another step forward. Women hung lanterns, the hall filled with the scent of baked bread, laughter, and anticipation. When I walked onto the small stage, applause erupted, surprising me with its force. I stood there, humbled, as the mayor introduced me as a pillar of quiet strength, a woman who turned pain into purpose. I wasn't used to titles, but the love in that room wrapped around me like a cloak. My eyes scanned the crowd, and that's when I saw them. Elena and Derek standing at the back, half hidden by shadows. Their faces were pale, strained, nothing like the glittering couple who once mocked me beneath a canopy of roses. Elena's hair hung limp. Derek's suit was ill-fitting, his arrogance shriveled by defeat. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old ache, the longing for the daughter I once knew. But it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by a steady calm. They pushed their way forward after the speeches, faces arranged in strained smiles. "Mother," Elena said, her voice honeyed but hollow, "we've missed you." Derek added quickly, "Yes, Clara, we were hoping we could talk privately. There are opportunities we'd like to share with you. With your support, we can rebuild everything." Their words were knives dressed as invitations. I heard what they didn't say. "We need your money. We need your safety net. We need you, not as a mother, but as a wallet." I looked at them, really looked. Elena's eyes darted nervously. Derek's jaw clenched with desperation. Behind them, the women I had taught, my chosen family, watched in silence, their presence a wall of quiet strength. I felt no rage, no triumph, only clarity. They hadn't come back because they loved me. They had come because their world was collapsing, and they thought I might hold it up again. I stepped down from the stage, lantern light flickering across my face. Elena reached for my hand, but I didn't extend it. Derek began to speak again, but his voice faltered under the weight of my silence. I held their gaze, steady and unyielding, until the words died in their throats. Around us, the room remained hushed, waiting. Then, softly, I smiled. Not the brittle smile of endurance, not the bitter smile of irony, but the serene smile of someone who has already won. Without a word, I turned and walked back toward the stage, back toward the women who had chosen me, back toward the life I had built from ashes. Behind me, I felt their desperation collapsing into emptiness. Elena's whisper reached me faintly, trembling with disbelief. "She's not going to help us." No, I wasn't. Because motherhood, once taken for granted, once turned into a transaction, could not be bought back with desperation. Because love, once betrayed, could not be repurchased with empty promises. Because dignity, once reclaimed, could not be stripped away again. The hall erupted once more in applause, not for them, but for me, for us. For every woman who had been told she was nothing and had risen anyway. I stood in the glow of lanterns, not as a mother erased, but as a woman reborn. Elena and Derek faded into the shadows. Their story would continue, I knew, but not with me inside it. My story had already outgrown them. Some debts can never be paid, some wounds never ask for apologies, and some victories require no battle cry. That night, I wore a crown of silence, and it was enough. There are debts that will never be repaid. And there are people who, when they smile in silence, watch the world around them crumble.